Welcome to this podcast, which I think we're going to frame as a bit of an emergency broadcast, kind of in the theme that we've done this in previous sessions. Now, for those who are watching this, they probably already know of Anton Chaitkin. Anton Chaitkin's been a friend, somebody I've learned from immensely. I'd say top three researchers and historians out there in the world who have influenced my thinking. Anton Chaitkin is right up there. So I recently, before we jump into today's emergency broadcast, I would just want to put out that Anton has just released a book, Who We Are: America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 2. Volume 2, that's available for purchase as of last week, tackling America from the 1830s to the 1890s. That's available in the description box. I highly recommend everybody pick up Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 3, I guess, is in the works, right, Anton?
That's right.
Cool.
Yeah, taking it up through John Kennedy. That's
So
the next volume.
if you don't know the past, you're going to repeat a lot of bad mistakes that should not be repeated. So these books are super vital resources. I highly recommend everybody pick them up, study, and share. Anton, thank you for sitting down with me today. I know we don't have a lot of time, but you definitely you called me up the other day or last night, and you shared some considerations that you had about the importance of a certain type of thinking and a certain type of understanding which is needed in any citizenry, especially in the United States, but anywhere in the world, if we're going to be able to navigate through the type of storm of disinformation, objective crises that are threatening human civilization as a whole, and not enough clarity about the principles at play. So I like the way you just wove your message to me, and I think, and then I said, "Hello, let's do a little broadcast for our audience." So I really appreciate you sitting down and doing this today. It's very important.
Yeah, I've been recently increasingly saddened and angered uh, by hearing people, well-meaning people, good people that I know, uh, who have opinions, very strong opinions about the current reality, which are in the context of the uh, the physical economy of our country and the geopolitics and the history that's involved. In those contexts, these strongly felt opinions are they're bordering on insane. They're irrelevant, uh, and they're nonsense. They're in the realm of complete nonsense. We need to uh, have different ways now, dramatic ways and literary ways and other artistic ways to jolt people out of this realm of mere opinion, an opinion on slices of reality. Uh, the same way that Socrates devoted his life and gave his life to dispel the idea that opinions are worth anything, and public opinion is almost always wrong. So there's a certain pathway of policy and action now that must be taken. It doesn't matter what opinion you have about some of these things, unless you're dealing with the issues that I'm going to raise here. You're simply off base. You're not in this world. You're in some other world. You're in fantasy.
Mm.
To some extent, Trump as the issue has obscured reality and prevented deliberation on the most urgent problems facing our country and the planet. So let's go through some of the dimensions of reality that have to be confronted. Regarding the economy, uh, there are certain uh, uh, national directed measures that are required to reverse the catastrophic decline of our civilization. The deindustrialization, the failure of our economy and related aspects of our society. We have a largely demoralized population in the United States. There's aggressive wars that are criminal wars, anti-national in their objectives. To the extent they have any objective that could be even spoken about in a normal way. Wars that would be punished by Nuremberg standards, with continuous mass slaughter. And people have, for example, opinions about one of these theaters of war or some other one. And I've heard in the last 48 hours, I've heard 4 different people tell me, when I was in a casual conversation about different ones of these wars or potential wars, that the war must continue for the person to be safe, or for some aspect of our society to be safe. The war in the Middle East must continue. That's many people have that view. War against China must happen to keep us safe. Wildly irrational viewpoints.
I agree. And I got to say, there's been a disturbing amount of, I would say, otherwise moral, patriotic types who have been revealing to me their similar opinions, which are strange. Like, for example, I've been getting from several sources of people who would identify as patriots that it were best, it would be a good idea to militarily invade Panama if the Panamanian government did not expel Chinese influence. As if that's somehow now that's imperialism. That people would die.
Exactly.
A lot of people would die because the Panamanians would not just keel over and wait for the military to come in and take control. So it's become a weird Orwellian shifting of definitions where patriotism has now become, or some form of nationalism has become imperialism. Or going to defend, like you said, the Taiwanese freedom fighters from the big bad Chi-Coms. That's all of a sudden American nationalism to champion that.
You can go back, as we may, if we have time, just mention that Panama has been invaded twice before by people in control of the United States, who hated the American system and point of view. The disasters that I've spoken of, the economic disaster, the degradation and demoralization of the population, the withdrawal of their humanity from under them, these disasters correspond to policy preferences and the financial system of the transatlantic oligarchs. Another dimension of reality that must be confronted is the history of these problems. Again, people have opinions as if they were 2-dimensional photographs of something that occurs over a 5-second time span, or maybe a 1-year time span. It's just about as relevant. Whereas most of these problems, all of these problems, the basic issues that we're talking about here, constitute the central life, political life, and fighting, context for our country's history back from the very beginning on the 2 sides. The side of our greatest national leaders, pro-national leaders, versus this same transatlantic oligarchy. Let's go to, for example, let's go to the economics, so we get it, just to get it to be tasted, and then bring in the war and some of the other issues and what you would have to do to straighten these things out. First of all, you need reciprocal tariffs, protective tariffs, but reciprocal, and trade deals. Trump has some aspect of that. And to the extent that he's caused panic or outrage from these crazed, financiers, that's all to the good. But you have to go back to our history and what were these things? How were they used? What is this? What is this all about? There's no context now. Nothing. It's up in fantasy land in a sense, because you're not going from simply a tariff to rebuilding a shattered economy and a shattered population. You're going to get back onto the path to nuclear war and disaster. You need federal credit arrangements for large-scale new infrastructure. No considerable infrastructure was ever built in the United States without federal credit and federal and state, sometimes local, but largely federal credit and federal sponsorship for the infrastructure that built the country. You need federal leadership now, especially in the 21st century, for technical and scientific advances in certain obvious areas like space, nuclear fission, and nuclear fusion. There's some certain other areas, materials and some other things, but the space program, nuclear science, and so forth, without federal leadership, it goes nowhere. It's a disaster. It's based on lies. The whole idea of going to Mars, for example, by simply wishing to do so without dealing with what the technology requires. You have to accelerate. Nobody's discussing that. You have to get there in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks instead of a year. It doesn't function otherwise, and you're lying about it if you're not bringing this up. Just to bring that into the conversation. You have to have support for the population, popular support in the reindustrialization process. You have to center on education. There's no serious education of the younger people in the country going on now for a modern society, modern economy. Leave out the culture wars, leave out the degradation, the specific degraded aspects that are pushed by this elite. Leave that aside. There's no serious education to make the United States a powerful and successful country again. You have to have something like apprenticeship. You have to have the creation of industry, modern industry, that is in advance of the employment. Is you're going to have to set up centers of industry, science, technology, same thing in agriculture probably, in advance of the people being qualified to do it. You're going to have to do a lot of things all at once if you're actually serious about reconstructing this economy. Part of the support for the population means taking on the demoralization in many aspects. For example, drug addiction. Suicide is affected by all of this, but just take drug addiction. In this, especially in centers where the industry has been shut down. But otherwise, you have hundreds of thousands of people that are dying from drug addiction. So you have to be able to take care of people while you're setting up a different economy than we've had. You have to be able to go back to the economy that was successful. I'm not talking about creating something new as a fantasy. I'm talking about simply resuming the progress that was the mission of the country in the past. So on drugs, for example, one aspect of that is a serious war on drugs that has little to do with prisons and the justice system. It has a lot to do with shutting down, by cooperation between the major nations, shutting down the offshore financial system and the bankers who launder the drug money, the people whose policy is to cause poverty and demoralization in many countries at the same time. That system of offshore, unaccountable financier power has to be cracked and crushed. And that's not just a matter of punishing people. It's a matter of understanding what it is and getting the necessary forward motion for our own economy and our own credits, directed credits.
Mm.
That's not communism. It's not socialism. It's our system that we've had in the past. Then you
Yeah,
have
you're
just
basically
two other.
talking about,
Go ahead.
sorry, because I can still hear, so many people watching this, and some of them I could hear them screeching in their brains because the war on drugs was such a disaster. And I think I'd
It
like to,
was.
yeah, it was. You clearly are identifying that the war on drugs as it happened was a disaster, but you're describing something different that never happened, which is that if you really want to, just to be clear, if you really want to destroy the drug problem, you don't put local dealers on the street corner into prison in the prison industrial complex to be cheap labor and ignore the top down agencies of the Wall Street, the London banks that have been controlling and organizing the entire narcotics trade for generations. That's what has to be dealt with. And the only way that you're saying to deal with that, the only power we have available to properly deal with it is the sovereign nation state that can wield the type of power to break that
And
is
of
the point
course,
you're getting at, right?
and of course, you have the cultural side of this that
Mm,
you got to have leadership again for beautiful uh, uh, and uplifting music and art and the rest of the recently abandoned aspects and
right.
vilified aspects of Western civilization and Eastern civilization for that matter.
Mm,
Um, so then just two other items. One of them is on the war. You need confidence building measures between the United States and what are called our adversaries, such as Russia, China, Iran. We could leave out North Korea. Uh, but the major and also the all the countries in the Middle East, for example, who are experiencing the United States as an irrational mass murderer through Israel. Uh, so what are confidence building measures? I would say that the first one, aside from just restoring the treaty process and cooperation to step away from nuclear war directly, like Kennedy did with stopping the tests, the nuclear tests, and stopping and making treaties to reduce nuclear weapons and so forth. Real confidence building means that you demonstrate by your actions that the United States is on the path to building up its actual power. Because to the extent that the United States is a hollowed out post-industrial zombie of a country, all we have is nuclear weapons and maybe Wunderwaffen that these insane people in that faction of the Pentagon like to think about. But so that we're always to the extent that we're weak industrially and in our real science and our infrastructure and so forth, uh, you're telling the rest of the world and these adversaries that we are always threatening to start a nuclear war. So if you build up the USA, you're backing by that our strength, and I don't mean threats, and I don't mean deploying armies all over the world in fleets. I'm talking about actual strength.
mm,
That convinces people that we're not out for a disastrous war. Uh, by the way, one thing I didn't mention on the uh, on the economy, which is obvious, should be obvious, is that there's no discussion in the Trump circle or among Democrats of the level of new infrastructure that's required to make the United States a viable country. I mean,
mhm.
viable society, let alone economy, and to control inflation, for example, by freight carrying and other forms of transport, high speed, energy dense forms of infrastructure. I mentioned nuclear power, uh, but also the kind of infrastructure that is going to uh, work together, uh, like the kind of electrification, the pursuit of other forms of energy, and so forth. Without these things, without the renewal of the city's infrastructures, you're not serious about building the economy. Forget the tariffs. Without this, you have nothing. And this was the basis for the original booms of that lasted. They weren't just boom of craziness that led to a crash.
Hmm.
The last thing I would mention is that I would say, and this is a challenge to people's thinking, and I think this challenge has to be repeated again and again. We need new religious leadership. We need a people to step forward who have some understanding of our relations with what it means to be holy and anything divine. That that puts that promotes and fights for man in the image of God, which has been that concept has been destroyed. It has been attacked for a century and a half or more from the top down, especially in Britain and then in the United States, obviously elsewhere in Europe and so forth. But I would take three topics in that realm. Number one, does a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu consider themselves to be honorable, thoughtful, not a liar, not a devil, and yet they might condone and promote continual and escalating mass slaughter of their fellow human beings. What a horrifying outrage on human understanding. It's designed to make people hate religion.
Yeah.
So people who have religious views. I don't want to get into specifics because it goes beyond the usual suspects. This is very broad. Those who hold to the necessity for mass slaughter, for continual mass slaughter, and lying about it all the time by the leaders doing it, and they themselves put themselves forward as being somehow religious. They are, in a very real sense, engaged in a continuous attack on religion by doing so. So war is one thing. The next thing is family. This is pretty simple in one sense. Democrats are for various, forms of what could easily be called perversion and, experiments instead of having a growing population based on the family. Republicans, on the other hand, have ever since I guess this began when Rockefeller became a big shot among Republicans, but that party promotes the idea that you should cut the budget in the
Are you
federal
talking
government.
about Nelson Rockefeller or?
No, I'm talking John D. Rockefeller, the Rockefeller
Way
family.
back when. Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Going
Okay,
the 18. I have that in my book, where he came from, what that's all about, in
okay.
this book that just came out, the 19th century. But
Mm.
so the Republican Party today, to contrast it with the Democrats being for liberal, anti-family things, the Republicans largely believe that you should have savage austerity so that people can't have families. The real people. you have some slogan or some theory by Adam Smith or something that says if people lose their jobs, they can always find another one. They can go into a different line of work or something. So, again and again, disproved, debunked, shown to be lies from imperialists. They don't care. They just say it anyway. And then the people who don't have any education just pick it up and say it. And that's what their party says. But they're as anti-family as the Democrats are. It's obvious. I mean, so on the other side, you have Lincoln and later Franklin Roosevelt. Same idea. You have to build up the industrial economy so we have jobs, the science of the country so we have mastery over nature, and you have to take care of the people with tariffs, with education, with a pro-labor attitude. You need labor unions. You need to have industrialists who believe in having progress and not robbing. They're not just financiers who want to have some offshore games and speculation. So what I'm saying is a religious leader today would have to begin a process of deliberation on what are we going to do about families? What is this thing? Why do we need families? That's a big discussion. But what's the policy? What's a national idea about families? And then the third aspect of this, and all this is, of course, controversial. The third aspect is the environmentalism. And you have this, again, going back to this transatlantic oligarchy, to the British royals, to various elements in Europe that promoted the idea that man is a beast and man should be mostly exterminated, low population, and people always fighting each other because there's limited resources. These views, these dystopian views, have always been in a war with the idea of cherishing man in the image of God. And so that has to be taken up now, because this radical environmentalism there are environmentalists who want to preserve, who want to have eliminate pollution. They want to have I don't know. They want to take care of the soil. These are obviously necessary things. But I'm talking about the basic philosophical premise that you need to have mankind's living standards cut. You need to prevent people who are largely colored skinned people from ever becoming industrialized and having electricity, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the program of the savage imperialist, and in the 20th century it was fascist program. So that's where a religious leader today who wants to be an actual leader has to begin to confront these things and take up this question from the standpoint of man in the image of God. We create, we improve our work. That's the image of God, creativity and creation in nature. And so man is going to increase his numbers, and we'll have families. And we will make inventions that will give us constantly increasing resources of all kinds. There's no limited resources. One thing gets run out of. You keep chopping trees down, you don't have enough trees. You get coal and oil and uranium. You don't have enough fresh water in some place, you move water. You take the salt out of water. You do other things. New resources.
Right.
When did uranium become a resource? How is that? Is that a limited resource? Well, it doesn't make any sense. It didn't exist before. Now it exists by our science. So these things
Well,
are
yeah, like your
religious people.
Uranium as an element existed, but as a resource,
Absolutely. That's what I mean.
Yeah, right. It changed from just simply being a mineral that you find in nature to all of a sudden being
That's
something
right.
we use, and thus called resource. So what allowed that transformation of its identity and its relationship to the human species? What caused
Yeah.
that is what you're asking, right? And that's an important point.
Yeah.
It's like that should be economics 101. in a healthy society is investigating what is that thing. And instead people are being given a lot of theories
It was.
about pricing. And you're saying
It
this used to
was.
be something that was understood.
When we had the first power plants in the early 1880s, and Edison personally set them up before the war on Edison and the war on electricity and everything else took place. When we had those power plants and we began electrifying the planet in many countries with Edison's partners, um, people were excited to do all kinds of things that had never been dreamed of before. The Wright brothers really come directly out of that excited new idea of electricity and power, invisible power, radio waves, things like this. That corresponds to the secrets of nature, and we've mastered them, and we're putting them at the service of man. So people saw that at certain times in our history. They saw it in front of them. Franklin saw that when he did these things in England with the geniuses over there in the 1760s and 70s when he was working with the Lunar Society. That's in my first volume to spur the Industrial Revolution there before these creeps in the East India Company said no other country is going to have these inventions and these science discoveries. We want to keep everybody backward. But at certain times in many countries, especially in the USA, we have seen new resources come into existence, better than the resources that they had to replace. It's better to have coal and oil than to keep chopping trees and burning wood for fuel, much better. And it's better to have uranium that works a lot more powerfully than coal and oil. And we'll have other things in the future. So, but to get back to the point that right now, how would you go to the right policy? You have to have people like a religious leader, like a politician who wants to delve into history, like some diplomat that has the courage to talk about confidence building measures that we had before. Don't get too specific about what's needed right now because you're missing the point. How it sounds contradictory. But in order to get something across to people, you have to and make it credible, you have to show that we have been on the right track at certain times in the past, and not just on the right track, but we accomplished unbelievable miracles that has driven America forward and the world forward, civilization forward. We also committed terrible crimes, and we're committing them now on the same basis that we did then.
Right.
We didn't see Indians and black people from Africa as man in the image of God. What do we see now? What do we see anywhere in the world? The people who promote popular culture today don't have that view, and they want to erase it. Dystopia. You've written a lot about this. You're in many ways the expert of this attack on our cherished view of man. So the leadership that needs to be formed to solve these problems and to get the new leaders that will supplant Trump when he's out of office, or even now that will come up to buttress him or cast him aside or whatever is going to be necessary to get the right policy to defend our nation and our civilization. That leadership depends on confronting reality. What's the reality of our economy? Are you going to really get to that by having a tariff that allows you to set up an artificial intelligence chip making machine somewhere? Does that give you dominance? Do you have advancement when you have dominance of the satellite region of space for the Air Force, the Space Force? It's completely delusionary.
Yeah, there's this mantra that Pete Hegseth has been sort of repeating, which is that America's foreign policy has to be peace through strength, which sounds fine depending on what one means when they use those words, except when you look at the way he's thinking as a self-identified crusader who said in his book that he published a couple of years ago that he's given his life over to a crusade against Islam and Chinese communism. This is the guy that has the Templar, the Kingdom of Jerusalem cross tattooed
Yeah.
on his chest. He's trying to like vocalize that power projection is the idea of a piece that of vassals. So if everybody just agrees to become vassals, who will then provide, who will pay into being allowed to have the privilege to be part of or under the sphere of influence of the prima inter pares of this new Pax Americana, this new empire, then there will be peace. If anybody tries to look out for their own national interests, well, then we got to prepare to go to war. So it's a very perverse idea of that, taking the worst elements of the Roman Empire and then using words that sometimes seem nice, like he'll say things that will appeal to Christians, like we need, he'll say things like man is made in the image of a creator. He'll say that. But then if you look at practically how he's thinking about what is your definition of man? Are some more equal than others, right? In your idea of how the world should be, is the American citizen more valuable than a citizen in Africa or a child labor in Congo or an Arab in Palestine? Yeah, it seems like there's definite tiers there. Or let's say a Chinese person. Yeah, there's definitely a hierarchy, which is very dangerous. Steve Bannon has similar types of things too in his discourse. So it's super
If
important
you,
to clarify these
and
things.
then if you scratch it, uh, it's like I mentioned this in another program about the Post story about the man who was all used up. I think that was what it was called, about the Southern general Indian fighter, and he had artificial parts to him after battles.
Right.
And then when you kept taking these off, it turns out there was nothing to him at all. Uh, so if you scratch these kind of opinions about Americans and you're defending Americans, but the other people aren't worth, saving, or they're inferior, or they're just, you have to take second rank or something. They're not defending Americans. In what sense? The reality that I was talking about here, of the reality of the economy. Are you really defending the people that have lost their jobs by the hollowing out of this country and us now being far behind other countries in every aspect of our economy? Yeah, we have more money in some senses. We have more weapons in some senses. But what is the condition of the population? What's the condition of the younger people? What's their mental condition? What's their knowledge? What's the basis and the foundation of our country? Don't tell me you're defending the United States if you're not dealing with these realities in a really urgent and humble way. And you're trying to go search our history and search our souls to get to how we're going to find a path of policy and action.
Mm-hmm. I could imagine, and I really want to get your thoughts on this. A lot of people might hear what you've just said about the need to not just simply have tariffs alone, but all of those things you just outlined. They would say, well, doesn't that fly in the face of the natural Austrian school traditions upon which America was founded? The idea of if anybody hears any fallacies in what I just said, I'll let that just sit there. But
All
that's a
right.
big thing, right? That's the libertarian principles upon which America was founded. Doesn't that what you've just proposed totally
Yeah.
fly in the face of all of that? So what would you say to
Well,
those
first
people?
of all, with any of the people in the Trump circle, there's a lot of partial truths. Uh, and in the establishment, the permanent establishment we've had ruling us for the last 70 years or so, there's almost nothing, no truths in any respect. So you give them that. And again, also, there are people who believe in the Austrian school. This is the ultra free trade, free market idea. Who are friends of mine and who are who are good people. They're especially good in the sense that they don't think that there should be wars uh, most of the time, and so that's good. But to see the the two sides in our history and in the history of Europe, but especially since the creation of the United States, the Austrian school is there's no honest person can dispute this once you know those two sides, the imperialists versus nation builders. The Austrian school was created by the imperialists to try to destroy the the idea of the rights of people to self-advancement. It's just very simple. The two bogeymen of this Austrian school were Abraham Lincoln and Bismarck. They're hated by this school in terms of their economic policy and their politics. Very specifically, in the 20th century, it goes back earlier than that against Bismarck and so forth, but the relevant issue is that in the beginning of the 1920s, when Europe was shattered, was in ruins from World War I, the Bank of England leader, Montague Norman, who began serving 24 years as head of the Bank of England and to a great extent the head of the central banks of the world, and through the New York Fed, our Federal Reserve System, except when Franklin Roosevelt was president. So this guy in the early 1920s, Montague Norman worked with League of Nations leaders and certain other people in the British orbit to take the destroyed former empire of Austro-Hungary, and where they had set up a country called Austria, very small country without much resources, and said, we're going to make a model out of this for what should come now. And this is the birth of the fascism of nations, of states in Europe. So they set up a regime there with a prime minister dedicated to the will of the Bank of England, to cut the budget, to fire the state employees, and to lower the wages, and to get militia people that would attack opponents of this process. The economic advisor to the prime minister in this first experiment with fascism was Ludwig von Mises, and his right-hand man was Friedrich Hayek. They went from there to other adventures of the imperialists, and Hayek, of course, ended up at the University of Chicago at the end of World War II. And in his book about free trade and how we got to have free markets, the book, The Road to Serfdom, everybody should, if they're interested, they can read the last chapter. And in that chapter says that we need a world, in effect, a world government to police all the nations, to prevent anybody from going off the program to try to have protectionism for their people. So there's so much for freedom, the idea of freedom. If you don't have freedom, then what's the idea of free markets? You also won't have any markets if the economy crashes. So it's like the man who is all used up. There's nothing there. It's simply a tool, this concept that you shouldn't interfere with trade and with the economy through a government that is an elected government. Now, you can't have experts. You can't have central bankers interfere all the time. They do. They set levels of money, currency, and so forth. And many of these Friedmanites will say that they're not for that. They want to have private printing of money. I guess crypto and everything else. But what's the history of it? Go look at the actual history. You have these two sides, and these guys have been on the side of this Anglo-American and to a certain extent Swiss, Amsterdam, Protestant French, and so forth, gang who are trying to cripple mankind. And that's what the Austrian School is about, in my view. And I think that's the history. You want to refute that? Let's have a debate about the history.
I like that. And I like leaving that challenge sort of floating out there, I think. And I think it's also an encouragement for people to actually read your works. Because I gotta say, I've done the work. I've read every book that Anton has put out. He backs up
Oh,
his position better than anybody. And I gotta say, Who We Are, volumes one and volume two, your newest two pieces. And I would also add, if people can acquire it, the legendary Treason in America book. I think you published that in the 80s. I have a 1991 edition. Essential reading for anybody who really wants to get a sense of the subversion of America's intellectual tradition, from the inside and from the outside. What were the forces? What were the ideas, the toxic ideas in play that derailed this natural evolution that was sparked, that we saw in a beautiful fashion in the Golden Renaissance, again in the American Revolution, again in Lincoln's victory to keep the Union together. And there's these coarse moments, these pregnant moments where Americans tapped into their better traditions and didn't act tragically. And it's so we're so cut off from that. Our school system, the Rockefeller funded reforms in our education system have severed it. The hack historiographers who've been paid for by the Council on Foreign Relations and these anti-American, but nominally American, but really anti-American think tanks that have poured tons of money into narratives that cut us off from this rich history that would give us a better insight into the nature of the fight that we're currently living in. Because it's the same fight. It's not a different thing. It's the exact same fight that Franklin Roosevelt was waging against the international oligarchy that he did battle with valiantly, that JFK was battling, that Martin Luther King was standing up to with Bobby Kennedy back in 66 to 68, and Lincoln and earlier on. So it's the same fight. And unless we can resituate ourselves within that tapestry, that story of human civilization, we're screwed. We're really not. We're up Shit's Creek. So I really appreciate so much your
thank
your
you.
offering
Thanks
this
for the
clarity, man. I
well,
really do.
well, good.
And
So thanks for having this little. I think it's an emergency situation. We could have peace, in the two theaters of war. They're directly related to each other, and they're related to each other because they were part of the Cold War. They're part of this continuing effort to make mankind into a post what do you call it, post-apocalyptic zone of zombies, and to get out of that, you can't approach this on an issue by issue basis. Where did Israel come from? Where did the problem with Russia come from? Go back to the great, before the so-called Great Game. It's the question of the self-government of nations. And the wars that are being fought now are anti-national wars. It was very explicit in the Middle East that in the British purposes and some of the Zionist purposes, and then were to stop the rise of Arab and other nation builders. And right now, it's a challenge to as I said, to the religious people to say, how can you possibly allow the image of the Jewish and Christian religions to be in the hands of people who are so, in my view, so obviously hysterically antagonistic to these religions, and they're the ones leading these wars. The Jewish settlers and some other people like that, some of the people in the Pentagon, et cetera, and so forth. So it's not that hard to approach this problem. It's not that complicated to approach the question of reality. But you have to be willing to really sharply criticize mere opinions
Yeah.
about
And you
Trump
and
and so
yeah.
forth.
And I think at the same time is you have to see yourself in the thing that you're trying to understand, because a lot of people get a little voyeuristic, and I think that also lends itself to a certain, whether they're
Yes,
overly
yes,
optimistic or overly black-pilled and cynical. In both cases, they don't see themselves. You got the QAnon, extreme QAnon, hopium addicts who are just sitting back watching the popcorn and waiting for the golden renaissance. On the other side, you have the black pilled, cynical, I know how bad it is. There's no way that anything can change. And in both cases, they don't see themselves as taking responsibility for the thing. So I think that's also the subjective part
yeah,
goes with what you're saying
yeah.
quite a bit too.
Well, thank you, Matt, and
Yeah.
let's resume this at a certain point.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Anton. And like I said, for everybody listening, buy the book. It's in the description box. Buy the book. Thank you, Anton. Till next time. Bye bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.